The morning of Bryony Ashworth's wedding dawned gray and unforgiving, much like the future that awaited her. She stood before the cracked mirror in her childhood bedroom, studying her reflection with the detached curiosity of someone observing a stranger. The wedding gown had belonged to her mother, carefully preserved in lavender sachets for 18 years, waiting for this day. It hung loosely on Bryony's slender frame, the ivory silk yellowed at the edges, the seed pearls missing in patches like fallen teeth. She was 18 years old today, 18, and in 3 hours she would become the Duchess of Ravenswyck. The thought should have thrilled her. Duchesses wore diamonds and commanded estates. They attended balls and influenced society. They did not scrub their own floors, or mend their own stockings, or lie awake at night, listening to their fathers stumble home drunk from gambling halls, pockets empty, and debts mounting. But Bryony felt no thrill, only the cold, creeping dread that had settled in her chest 3 weeks ago, when her father had summoned her to his study and informed her that she was to be married. Not asked. Informed. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Calloway, their housekeeper, the only servant they had managed to retain through the worst of their financial decline. "Your father wishes to see you, miss." The elderly woman's voice was gentle, but her eyes held something that looked almost like grief. In his study, before the carriage arrives, Bryony nodded, gathering her skirts with hands that trembled only slightly. She had learned long ago to conceal her fear. Fear was weakness, and weakness invited cruelty. Her father's study smelled of stale tobacco and desperation. Lord Osric Ashworth sat behind his desk, looking far older than his 50 years, his once handsome face bloated and sallow from drink. He did not rise when she entered. "Sit," he commanded. She remained standing. Something shifted in his bloodshot eyes, annoyance perhaps, but he let it pass. Today, after all, she was valuable to him. Today, she was the currency that would pay his debts. "The Duke's carriage will arrive within the hour," her father said, shuffling papers on his desk, as if this were merely a business transaction, which Bryony supposed it was. "You will comport yourself with dignity and gratitude. This marriage is a gift." "A gift," Bryony repeated quietly. "To whom?" Her father's jaw tightened. "Do not test me, girl. Do you have any idea what the Duke of Ravenswyck is offering? He has agreed to settle every debt I owe, every single one. In exchange for your hand, he has purchased this estate outright and returned it to our family free and clear. Your brother's education will be funded, your sister's dowry secured." Bryony absorbed this information in silence. She had known, in vague terms, that the Duke's offer was generous, impossibly generous, but hearing the specifics made her stomach clench with renewed unease. Why would a man pay such an astronomical sum for her? "I have never met the Duke of Ravenswyck," she said carefully. "I have never even seen him. No one has, not in years. They say he is a recluse. They say he is disfigured. They say a great many things." Her father cut her off impatiently. "What matters is that he is obscenely wealthy, and he wants you. Do not question your good fortune, Bryony. Simply accept it." But Bryony could not simply accept it. Questions burned in her mind, questions that had kept her awake for 3 weeks. Why her? Why specifically her? The Duke could have had any woman in England. Titled heiresses, renowned beauties, women with fortunes of their own rather than mountains of debt. Yet he had sent a letter directly to her father, naming her explicitly. Lady Bryony Ashworth. No other will do. Those words haunted her. They suggested something beyond mere business arrangement, something personal, something that made no sense because she had never met the man, never even glimpsed him at a society event. "Father," she said slowly, "did the Duke give any reason for his interest in me specifically?" Lord Osric's gaze slid away from hers. It was subtle, just a flicker. But Bryony had spent 18 years learning to read the small tells that preceded her father's lies. "He admired you at some event, I presume," her father said dismissively. "Does it matter? You are young, reasonably pretty, from a respectable family. That is enough." It was not enough. It was not nearly enough. But before Bryony could press further, a commotion arose from the front of the house. Carriage wheels on gravel, horses snorting. "He's here," her father said, rising from his desk with an expression that mingled relief and something that looked almost like fear. "Remember what I told you. Dignity. Gratitude. Do nothing to jeopardize this arrangement." Bryony followed him to the entrance hall on legs that felt wooden. Through the tall windows, she could see the carriage that had come for her, black and gleaming and emblazoned with the Ravenswick crest, a raven clutching a thorned rose in its talons. The footman who descended to open the carriage door wore black livery. Everything was black, she realized. Black horses. Black carriage. Black roses painted on the doors. As if she were attending a funeral rather than a wedding. Her own funeral, perhaps. The death of Bryony Ashworth, and the birth of whoever she would become as the Duchess of Ravenswick. "Come," her father urged, gripping her elbow too tightly. "Do not keep him waiting." But as they stepped onto the front portico, Bryony noticed something that made her falter. Two servants from a neighboring estate stood near the garden wall, speaking in hushed tones, unaware that their voices carried in the morning stillness. "Says the Duke specifically requested the Ashworth girl, would not consider anyone else. But why? She's pretty enough, I suppose, but hardly remarkable. And that family has nothing left but debts, and that crumbling house. That's just it, isn't it? No one knows why. Lord Pemberton offered his daughter, you know. Dowry of £40,000, and a face like an angel. The Duke refused without even meeting her. Said it had to be the Ashworth girl or no one. Strange business, very strange, almost like he already knows her somehow." Bryony's breath caught, like he already knows her somehow. But that was impossible. She had never met the Duke of Ravenswick. She had never even been to that part of the country. She had lived her entire 18 years within 20 miles of this estate, rarely venturing beyond the village, except for occasional trips to London that had ceased entirely once the money ran out. How could he know her? "Bryony," her father's voice was sharp. "The carriage. Now." She allowed herself to be guided forward, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers. The footman helped her into the carriage's dark interior, and the door closed behind her with the finality of a coffin lid. She was alone inside. The Duke had not come to collect his bride personally. Of course he hadn't. Why would he? As the carriage lurched into motion, carrying her away from everything she had ever known, Bryony pressed her hand against the cold window glass and made herself a promise. She would discover why the Duke of Ravenswick had chosen her, and she would survive whatever came next. The wedding ceremony took place in the private chapel at Ravenswick Hall, a Gothic structure of gray stone that seemed to grow from the fog-shrouded cliffs like something ancient and unyielding. Bryony walked the aisle alone. Her father had remained behind at Ashworth Manor, his debts already settled, his usefulness to her at an end. There were no guests, no flowers, and no music. Just the elderly vicar, 2 servants as witnesses, and the man waiting at the altar. The Duke of Ravenswick stood with his back to her, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed entirely in black. Even from behind, he radiated a kind of coiled power that made the air feel heavy. And then he turned. Bryony's steps faltered. The left side of his face was devastatingly handsome, all sharp angles and aristocratic elegance. Dark hair swept back from a high forehead, a strong jaw, lips that might have been sensual had they not been pressed into a grim line. But the right side told a different story. Scars twisted from his temple to his jaw, the skin puckered and silver white, pulling at the corner of his eye and the edge of his mouth. Not grotesque, exactly, but striking. Impossible to ignore. And his eyes, both untouched by whatever had ravaged his face, were the color of winter frost. They fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath. She had expected cruelty in that gaze, lechery, perhaps, or cold indifference. What she had not expected was recognition. He looked at her as if he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Lady Bryony. His voice was low and resonant, carrying the faint rasp of disuse. You came. I was not given a choice, she replied, before she could stop herself. Something flickered in his frost-colored eyes. Pain, perhaps, quickly concealed. No, I suppose you were not. The ceremony was brief. Vows exchanged in voices that echoed off the stone walls. A ring slipped onto her finger, cold and heavy, set with a blood-red ruby surrounded by black diamonds. When the vicar pronounced them wed, the Duke didn't kiss her. He merely offered his arm with stiff formality and escorted her from the chapel into her new life. Ravenswyke Hall loomed before them, a sprawling manor of dark stone and narrow windows that watched like suspicious eyes. Inside, the decor was surprisingly elegant, rich carpets and gleaming wood, but the atmosphere felt heavy with silence, unused, as if the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for something, or someone. Mrs. Drayton will show you to your chambers, the Duke said, as a stern-faced housekeeper materialized from the shadows. Rest, refresh yourself. We will dine together this evening, and then, he paused, something shifting in his expression. Then I will explain. Explain what? Bryony asked. Why I chose you. The words hung between them, weighted with promise and threat in equal measure. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the depths of his shadowed house, leaving Bryony with more questions than she had ever possessed in her life. The chambers assigned to Bryony were luxurious beyond anything she had experienced. A massive four-poster bed dominated the room, draped in deep burgundy velvet. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls, hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes. Through tall windows, she could see the moors stretching endlessly toward the horizon, wild and untamed, and somehow threatening. She bathed. She dressed for dinner in the finest gown Mrs. Drayton had provided, a deep emerald silk that fit her perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her measurements, which, Bryony realized with growing unease, it probably had. How long had the Duke been planning this? At precisely 7 o'clock, a footman arrived to escort her to the dining room. The table was set for two, candles casting intimate pools of light against the gathering darkness. The Duke stood at the window, staring out at the moors, and did not turn when she entered. Sit, he said. Not a request. Bryony sat, her spine rigid with tension. He remained at the window for a long moment, as if gathering courage. Then he turned and moved to take his seat across from her. In the candlelight, his scars appeared deeper, the damaged skin catching shadows in ways that emphasized rather than concealed. You are afraid of me, he observed. I'm cautious, Bryony corrected. I find it prudent to be cautious around things I do not understand. And you do not understand why you are here. You chose me specifically. You paid a fortune for a penniless girl from a disgraced family. You refused richer, more beautiful, more suitable brides. She met his winter frost eyes without flinching. No, Your Grace, I do not understand at all. The Duke was silent for a moment. Then he reached for his wine glass and drank deeply before speaking. 6 years ago, he began, I nearly died. Bryony waited. I was 24 years old. My father and elder brother were with me, returning from a business matter in the north. Our carriage was attacked on a remote stretch of road. Bandits, we thought at first. Later, we discovered it was assassination. His voice remained flat, emotionless, as if reciting facts from a distant history. My father and brother were killed instantly. I was shot, stabbed, and left for dead in a ravine. The attackers set fire to the wreckage. They wanted no survivors, no witnesses. Bryony's hand had risen to her throat without her realizing it. That's terrible. I should have died. The injuries were catastrophic. The fire. He gestured vaguely toward his scarred face. But somehow I crawled away, dragged myself through the forest for nearly a mile before collapsing near a stream. Something cold began to creep through Bryony's veins. A stream. A forest. I drifted in and out of consciousness for what felt like days, the Duke continued. I remember fever, pain, the certainty that death was coming for me. And then, his frost-colored eyes locked onto hers with sudden intensity. Then I remember a girl. Bryony's breath stopped. A young girl, perhaps 12 years old, with dark hair and the most remarkable gray eyes I had ever seen. She found me in the forest, more dead than alive. Any sensible person would have run. I was a stranger, badly wounded, half out of my mind with fever. Dangerous. But this girl did not run. No. Oh no. She tended my wounds with whatever she could find. Strips torn from her own petticoat, water from the stream. She talked to me, I remember, though I could not make sense of the words. When she left, I thought she had abandoned me. But she returned, again and again, over 3 days, bringing food, medicine, clean bandages. She nursed me back from the edge of death, and she never once asked who I was or what had happened. She simply showed me kindness. Bryony could not breathe, could not think. The room seemed to spin around her as memories she had buried for 6 years came flooding back. A wounded stranger in the woods, blood everywhere, the stench of smoke and burned flesh, gray eyes that had burned with fever, but somehow still held ferocity, like a wounded wolf that might strike at any moment. She had been terrified, but she had also been unable to walk away. That girl saved my life, the Duke said quietly, and I have never forgotten her face. I have never stopped searching for her. He leaned forward, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. Her name was Bryony Ashworth. She was the daughter of a minor lord whose estate bordered the forest where I nearly died. And 6 years later, she has become my wife. Silence descended like a shroud. You remember now, he said. It was not a question. Bryony's voice emerged as barely a whisper. I thought you were a vagrant, a poacher, perhaps. I never told anyone because I was afraid they would arrest you. I never imagined that you had saved the life of a duke? She shook her head slowly, trying to reconcile the fevered, broken man from her memories with the cold, scarred figure before her now. You were dying. I did what anyone would do. Anyone would not. His voice sharpened. I have seen humanity at its worst, Lady Bryony. I have seen people pass by, suffering without a second glance. I have seen greed and cruelty and indifference that would make your stomach turn. But you, a child of 12, showed more courage and compassion than any adult I have ever known. Bryony did not know what to say. Her mind was reeling. I searched for you for years, he continued. But I knew so little. A girl named Bryony. Dark hair, gray eyes, an estate near those woods. It was not enough. My investigators found dozens of possibilities, none of them right. His jaw tightened. Then, 3 months ago, I received word that Lord Osric Ashworth was drowning in gambling debts, that he had a daughter named Bryony, the right age, the right description. I made inquiries. I obtained a miniature portrait. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small oval frame, turning it so she could see. Her own face looked back at her, painted 2 years ago when her father still harbored hopes of marrying her advantageously. The moment I saw this, the Duke said, I knew I had found you at last. So you bought me. The words came out harsher than she intended, like a horse at auction, like a piece of property. Something that might have been pain crossed his damaged features. I gave your father an offer he could not refuse. I secured your family's future. I ensured you would want for nothing for the rest of your life. But I understand how it must appear to you. He set down the portrait. I understand if you hate me for it. Bryony stared at him, this strange man who had upended her entire existence based on a single act of childhood kindness. She should be angry. She was angry. But beneath the anger was something more complicated. He had remembered. For 6 years, he had remembered a nameless girl who had bandaged his wounds and brought him bread and water. He had searched for her. He had waited until she was of age. And when the opportunity arose, he had seized it with both hands. It was obsessive, possibly unhinged, certainly unconventional. But it was also, in its twisted way, the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her. I do not hate you, she said finally. But I don't know you either, Your Grace. You have built this marriage on a memory of a 12-year-old child. I am not that child anymore. No, he agreed. You are not. You are a woman now, with your own thoughts and desires and fears. I have no illusions about that. Then what do you expect from this marriage? What do you want from me? The Duke was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded almost like vulnerability. I want nothing you are not willing to give. I brought you here to repay a debt, yes, but also because— He stopped, seemed to wrestle with the words. I have been alone for 6 years. Alone in this house. Alone with my scars, and my ghosts, and my memories. The only light in all that darkness was you. A girl who saw a monster bleeding in the forest, and chose compassion over fear. He rose from the table, and moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. I do not expect you to love me, Lady Bryony. I do not even expect you to like me. But I hope in time that you might come to see me as something other than the stranger who bought you from your father. He looked back at her, and for just a moment, the cold mask slipped. Beneath it was something raw and lonely and desperately human. I hope you might see me as the man whose life you saved. Then he was gone, leaving Bryony alone with the guttering candles and the weight of a truth she had never expected to discover. Bryony did not sleep that night. She lay in her magnificent bed, staring at the canopy above, replaying the Duke's revelations over and over in her mind. The wounded stranger in the forest, the 3 days of secret nursing, the grateful pressure of his hand on hers before she had left him for the final time, fever broken, color returning to his ravaged face. She had thought about that stranger often over the years, wondered if he had survived, wondered if she had done enough. The not knowing had haunted her, a loose thread in the tapestry of her life that she could never quite tie off. And now she knew. He had survived. He had become a duke. He had searched for her across 6 years and countless miles, driven by a memory and a debt he considered unpaid. It was overwhelming, terrifying. And yet, beneath all of that, there was something almost like relief. She was not here because she was beautiful or accomplished or from a powerful family. She was here because of who she was, because of something she had done, a choice she had made, that had mattered to someone. When had anything she'd done ever mattered before? Morning came gray and misty, the moors outside her window shrouded in fog. Bryony dressed herself, refusing to ring for the maid, whose presence still felt like an invasion of privacy, and made her way downstairs in search of breakfast. Ravenswick Hall was even larger than she had realized, a labyrinth of corridors and staircases and rooms that seemed to multiply the further she walked. She passed a music room, a library, a gallery lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Everything was immaculate, but somehow lifeless, like a museum rather than a home. She found the morning room by following the scent of coffee. The Duke was already there, seated at a small table near the window, reading a newspaper with his scarred profile turned toward the light. He did not look up when she entered. "Good morning," Bryony ventured. "Is it?" His tone was dry rather than hostile. "I confess I rarely notice." She poured herself tea from the sideboard and selected a scone before taking the seat across from him. The silence stretched, not quite uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken things. "I have been thinking," Bryony said finally, "about what you told me last night." The Duke set down his newspaper, giving her his full attention. In daylight, his scars were less dramatic, the damaged skin appearing almost silver in the morning light. His frost-colored eyes remained unreadable. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That you are either the most romantic man in England, or the most obsessive, possibly both." His lips twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. "A fair assessment. I also think," she continued carefully, "that we are strangers who happen to be married. Whatever debt you feel you owe me, whatever memories you have carried, they are of a child. I am not that child anymore, as I said. You do not actually know me." "No," he agreed, "I do not. But I would like to." The simple sincerity of the statement caught her off guard. She had expected arguments, defensiveness, and the cold arrogance that seemed to be his default expression. Not this quiet admission of intent. "Then perhaps we should start again," Bryony suggested, "as if this were a normal marriage, as if we were two people who had chosen each other willingly. Can you do that? Pretend you chose this?" "I'm not pretending anything. I am suggesting that we move forward rather than dwelling on circumstances neither of us can change." She met his eyes steadily. "You said you want nothing I am not willing to give." "Very well. What I am willing to give, for now, is the chance to know each other. Without expectations, without pressure, without the weight of debts and memories making every interaction fraught." The Duke studied her for a long moment. Then he inclined his head in acknowledgement. "A reasonable proposal. Where would you like to begin?" "You could start by telling me your name." He blinked. "You know my name." "I know you are the Duke of Ravensweck. I know your surname is Blackmere, but no one has told me what to actually call you." For the first time since she had met him, something that looked like genuine amusement crossed his features. "Theron. My name is Theron." "Theron," she repeated, testing the syllables. Strong. Unusual. It suited him. "And you may call me Bryony. Since we are apparently married, formalities seem rather absurd." "Bryony." He said her name like he was tasting something precious. "I have waited 6 years to speak that name aloud to its owner." The intensity of the statement made her cheeks warm. She looked away, focusing on her scone, suddenly very interested in the texture of the clotted cream. The days that followed took on a strange rhythm. Theron, she learned, was a creature of rigid habit. He rose at dawn, took breakfast in the morning room, and spent the bulk of his days in his study managing the vast Ravenswick estate. He did not receive visitors. He did not attend social functions. He barely left the grounds of the manor, except for occasional solitary rides across the moors at dusk. He was, in every sense of the word, a recluse. "Why do you hide away here?" Bryony asked one afternoon, a week into their marriage. They had fallen into the habit of taking tea together in the library, a compromise between his need for solitude and her growing restlessness. Theron set down his cup with careful precision. "I do not hide. I simply choose not to subject myself to the stares and whispers of society. Because of your scars? Because of what they represent?" His jaw tightened. "My father and brother died in that attack. I survived. There are those who find my survival suspicious, who whisper that perhaps I arranged the whole thing, murdered my own family to inherit the dukedom. Bryony's stomach turned. That's monstrous. It is human nature to suspect the worst, especially of those who are already different. He gestured vaguely toward his face. The scars make me memorable, recognizable. Every time I appear in public, the whispers begin again. It became easier to simply stay away. Easier, Bryony repeated, but also lonelier. He did not deny it. She watched him across the library, this complicated man who had bought her like a painting at auction, but spoke to her like an equal, who carried the scars of tragedy on his face and the weight of suspicion on his shoulders, who had searched for 6 years to find the girl who had shown him kindness in his darkest moment. "Teach me about the estate," she said impulsively. He looked up, surprised. "The estate? I am the Duchess of Ravenswick now, am I not? I should understand what that means. The tenants, the lands, the household management. All of it." Something shifted in his expression. Hope, perhaps, quickly concealed. "You want to learn?" "I want to be useful. I spent 18 years being decorative and invisible. I should like to be something more." Theron studied her for a long moment. Then he rose and extended his hand. "Come with me." She took it. His palm was warm and calloused, not the soft hand of an idle aristocrat. He led her through the manor to his study, a vast room lined with maps and ledgers and estate records dating back generations. "This is Ravenswick," he said, unrolling a detailed map across the massive desk. 12,000 acres, 300 tenant families, 2 villages, a mill, a quarry, and more sheep than I care to count. Bryony leaned over the map, genuinely fascinated. "It's enormous. It is a responsibility." He pointed to various features as he spoke, his voice losing some of its habitual coldness as he warmed to the subject. "The eastern fields have the best soil, but require careful rotation. The northern tenants have been struggling since the flooding last spring. The quarry provides steady income, but the working conditions need improvement." For the next 2 hours, he walked her through the intricacies of running a duchy. She asked questions, dozens of them, and he answered each one with patience and obvious expertise. By the time they finished, the afternoon had faded into evening, and Bryony's head was spinning with new information. "You care about these people," she observed. "The tenants, the workers. You speak of them like they matter. They do matter. A title means nothing without the people who support it. My father taught me that before he died." Pain flickered across his features. "It is the one lesson I have tried to honor." Bryony reached out impulsively and touched his hand, where it rested on the map. Theron's breath caught. "I would like to help," she said quietly. "If you will let me. I want to be a real partner in this, not just a decorative duchess who hosts parties and looks pretty." "You would not be expected to host parties." His voice had gone rough. "I do not entertain." "Then perhaps we should change that." The words were out before she could consider them. Slowly, carefully, but eventually. "You cannot hide forever, Theron, and neither can I." He turned his hand beneath hers, his fingers curling around her palm. The touch sent unexpected warmth flooding through her. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" Fear, resentment, the calculation of a woman who had been sold to a monster. "You are not a monster." Bryony held his gaze steadily. "You are a man who has been through terrible things and survived them. That is not monstrous. That is human." Something cracked in his expression. For just a moment, the cold mask slipped entirely, and she saw the man beneath. Wounded, lonely, desperate for connection, but terrified of reaching for it. Then the mask returned, though perhaps not as firmly as before. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for seeing that." That night, as Bryony prepared for bed, she found herself standing at her window, staring out at the moonlit moors. Somewhere in the depths of the manor, Theron was in his own chambers, alone with his scars and his memories and his rigid solitude. He had chosen her because she had once shown him kindness, but kindness, she was beginning to realize, was not a single act completed in the past. It was an ongoing choice, made fresh every day. She could resent him for buying her. She could endure this marriage with cold civility until the end of her days. Or she could choose to see the man behind the monster, to reach past the scars, both visible and invisible, to build something real from this strange foundation of memory and debt. She thought of his hand in hers over the map, the roughness of his palm, the way his breath had caught at her touch, as if kindness was so foreign to him that he did not know how to receive it. She thought of his eyes when he spoke of his father's death, the pain he carried, the isolation he had chosen rather than face the whispers of a cruel world. She thought of the wounded stranger in the forest, gray eyes burning with fever, hand reaching for hers like a drowning man reaching for shore, and she realized, with a flutter of something that felt dangerously like anticipation, that she was no longer dreading this marriage. She was starting to feel something she had not expected to feel at all. The weeks that followed transformed Ravenswick Hall in ways both subtle and profound. It began with small things, fresh flowers appearing in vases that had sat empty for years, curtains thrown open to let in the pale northern light, the sound of voices in corridors that had known only silence for far too long. Bryony had taken to her role as Duchess with a determination that surprised even herself. She met with Mrs. Drayton daily to review household matters. She visited tenant families, learning their names, their struggles, their hopes. She pored over estate ledgers until the numbers began to make sense, then offered suggestions that Theron, after initial skepticism, had to admit were sound. But the greatest change was in Theron himself. He still retreated to his study for hours at a time. He still avoided mirrors and flinched when servants looked too long at his scars. But he no longer took his meals alone. He no longer disappeared at dusk for those solitary rides that had been his only escape from the prison of his own making. Instead, he spent his evenings with Bryony. They read together in the library, occupying opposite ends of the same settee, their feet nearly touching beneath shared blankets. They debated philosophy and politics over dinner, discovering that they disagreed on nearly everything and enjoyed the arguments immensely. They walked the grounds together in the gray afternoon light, Theron pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his childhood before tragedy had reshaped him. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows and a fire roared in the library hearth, Bryony looked up from her book to find Theron watching her. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "I was remembering," he said quietly, "what this room felt like before you came. Empty. Silent. A tomb of books that no one read and thoughts that no one heard." His gaze held hers. "You have brought this house back to life, Bryony. I am not certain you understand what that means." "I understand that houses are not meant to be tombs," she replied softly. "Neither are people." Something passed between them in that moment, something unspoken but undeniable. The air seemed to thicken, charged with possibility. Then Theron looked away, and the moment passed. But it left something behind, a new awareness, a tension that hummed beneath their increasingly comfortable routine. "My brother used to chase me through those hedges," he said one afternoon, gesturing toward an overgrown maze behind the east wing. "He was 7 years older, but he never let that stop him from playing with me. Said a future duke needed to know how to run from his enemies." Bryony heard the grief beneath the casual words. "You miss him?" "Every day." Theron's jaw tightened. Cedric was everything a duke should be. Charming, confident, beloved by everyone who met him. I was always the spare, the quiet one who preferred books to balls. When he died, he stopped walking, his gaze fixed on the distant maze. When he died, I had no idea how to be what everyone needed me to be. So you stopped trying. I stopped pretending. There is a difference. He turned to look at her, his frost-colored eyes softer than she had ever seen them. At least, that is what I told myself. Now, I wonder if I simply gave up. Bryony moved closer, close enough to touch his arm. He tensed, but did not pull away. You survived, she said quietly. You kept the estate running. You cared for your tenants, and your lands, and your responsibilities. That is not giving up, Theron. That is enduring. Enduring is not living. No, she agreed, but it is a start. They stood together in the fading light, the wind whipping across the moors and tangling Bryony's hair. Theron reached out, almost hesitantly, and brushed a strand from her face. His fingers were gentle against her cheek. You make me want to do more than endure, he said. You make me want to remember what living feels like. Her heart stuttered in her chest. Theron, I know. He withdrew his hand, the mask of composure sliding back into place. I know I have no right to want anything from you. This marriage was my design, my obsession. You owe me nothing beyond your presence. That is not what I was going to say. He looked at her sharply. I was going to say, Bryony continued, her voice steady despite the wild beating of her heart, that I am beginning to understand why that girl in the forest could not walk away from you. There is something in you, Theron Blackmere, that calls to something in me. I do not fully understand it yet, but I am no longer afraid of it. Something blazed in his eyes. Hope, hunger, a desperate wanting that he quickly tried to conceal. Bryony! A shout from the house interrupted whatever he had been about to say. They turned to see a footman running toward them, his face pale with urgency. Your Grace, an urgent message from London. The magistrate says it cannot wait. Theron's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. He took the sealed letter from the footman's trembling hands and broke the wax with his thumb. Bryony watched his face as he read, watched the color drain from his scarred cheeks, watched his hands begin to shake. Theron, what is it? He looked up at her, and for the first time since their wedding, she saw fear in his eyes. They found them, he said hoarsely. The men who killed my father and brother. They have been hiding in London for 6 years, protected by someone powerful. But they have been found, and they are talking. His grip on the letter tightened until the paper crumpled. They are naming names, including the name of the person who hired them. That is good news, is it not? Justice, finally. You don't understand. Theron's voice was barely a whisper. The person who hired them, the one who ordered my family's murder. They are saying it was someone close to us, someone who stood to benefit from the Blackmere line being extinguished. Bryony's blood ran cold. Who? Theron met her eyes, and what she saw there made her stomach drop. My uncle, Lord Erasmus Blackmere, the man who has been managing my affairs in London since the attack. The man who, his voice cracked, the man who arrives tomorrow to pay his respects to my new bride. The night that followed passed in a blur of tension and preparation. Theron sent messages to the magistrate, to his solicitors, to trusted allies whose names Bryony did not recognize. He paced his study like a caged wolf, the controlled composure she had come to know replaced by something rawer and more dangerous. Lord Erasmus Blackmere, she learned, was Theron's father's younger brother. He had been the one to identify the bodies after the attack, the one who had nursed Theron through his recovery, The one who had managed the duchy's London affairs while Theron retreated into isolation. I trusted him, Theron said, his voice hollow. For 6 years, I trusted him completely. He was the only family I had left. And all this time, he was the one who... He could not finish the sentence. Bryony did what she could, which was not much. She sat with him through the long night, a silent presence in his study while he worked through his rage and grief. She brought him tea he did not drink. She did not offer empty words of comfort because there were no words that could comfort this betrayal. Near dawn, he finally spoke to her directly. "You should leave." Bryony looked up from the book she had been pretending to read. "What?" "When my uncle arrives, you should be gone. I will arrange for you to stay in the village, or better yet, return to your family until this matter is resolved." "Absolutely not." Theron's eyes flashed. "This is not a debate. My uncle may have killed to claim this dukedom. If he discovers that I know, if he feels cornered, he could become dangerous. I will not risk you." "I am your wife." Bryony rose from her chair, matching his intensity with her own. "I did not marry you to flee at the first sign of trouble. Whatever happens, we face it together. You married me because your father sold you to pay his debts." The words hung between them, sharp and painful. Bryony felt them like a slap. "Yes," she said quietly. "That is how this began. But it is not what this has become. At least, not for me." Theron went very still. "I know you feel you owe me a debt," Bryony continued. "I know you built this marriage on memory and obligation. But somewhere in these weeks, something changed. You stopped being the stranger who bought me. You became..." She hesitated, then pushed forward. "You became someone I care about. Someone I choose. Not because I was sold to you, but because you are worth choosing." Bryony. Her name was a ragged sound from his throat. "So no, I will not leave. I will not hide in some village while you face a murderer alone. I stood by you once before, in a forest when I was 12 years old, and had every reason to be afraid. I will stand by you now." He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. His hands came up to cup her face, tilting it toward his. "You impossible woman," he breathed. "Do you have any idea what you do to me? Tell me. You make me hope." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "You make me believe that I could be more than scars and isolation and a title I never wanted. You make me want things I had convinced myself I could never have." "What things?" His answer was not in words. He kissed her. It was not gentle. There was too much desperation in it, too much longing held back for too long. His mouth claimed hers with a hunger that stole her breath, and Bryony responded in kind, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Theron pressed his forehead to hers. "Whatever happens today," he said roughly, "know that I love you. Not because you saved me 6 years ago. Not because of debt or obligation or memory. Because of who you are. Because of who you have become to me. I love you too." The words came easily, surprising her with their truth. "I think I have been falling since that first dinner, when you spoke of justice for your family, and I saw who you really are beneath the scars." He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a claim. Then the sound of carriage wheels on gravel shattered the moment. Lord Erasmus Blackmere had arrived. Bryony had expected Theron's uncle to look villainous. She had imagined sharp features, cold eyes, some visible mark of the corruption that festered in his soul. Instead, Lord Erasmus Blackmere was a pleasant-faced man in his late 50s, with the same aristocratic bone structure as his nephew, and none of the scars. His smile was warm, his manners impeccable, and his delight at meeting his nephew's new bride seemingly genuine. It made him infinitely more terrifying. "My dear girl," Erasmus said, clasping Bryony's hands in both of his. What a pleasure to finally meet you. I confess I was shocked when Theron wrote of his marriage, but seeing you now, I understand completely. Such beauty, such poise. You will be a credit to the Blackmere name. You are too kind, Lord Erasmus. Bryony forced a smile, hoping he could not feel the racing of her pulse. Theron stood rigid beside her, his expression carved from ice. He had not greeted his uncle with any warmth, merely a formal nod and a few clipped words. If Erasmus noticed the coldness, he gave no sign. I was so relieved when Theron finally emerged from his seclusion, Erasmus continued, settling into a chair in the drawing room as if he owned it. These past 6 years have been difficult for all of us, but especially for him. To lose one's father and brother so brutally, he shook his head with practiced sorrow. Well, we must simply be grateful that he survived. Against all odds, our Theron survived. Indeed, Theron said flatly. Against all odds. A shadow crossed Erasmus's gaze. Just a flash, quickly hidden, but Bryony caught it. Suspicion, perhaps. The first hint that this pleasant facade might be concealing something darker. The afternoon crawled by. Tea was served. Conversation was made. Erasmus shared news from London, political gossip and social scandal delivered with witty precision. To anyone watching, it was a perfectly ordinary family visit. But Bryony saw the way Theron's hands clenched whenever his uncle mentioned the attack. She saw the careful way Erasmus watched his nephew, as if gauging his reactions. She felt the tension building in the room, like pressure before a storm. Finally, as the light began to fade, Theron rose. "Uncle, there is a matter I must discuss with you, in private." Erasmus's pleasant expression did not waver. "Of course, dear boy. Shall we adjourn to your study?" "The study will do." Bryony stood as well. "I should stay here." Theron's voice was firm, but his eyes held a message. "Stay safe. Stay out of this." "We will not be long." She wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed at her not to let him face this alone, but she recognized the look on his face, the cold determination of a man about to confront his worst nightmare. "Very well," she said quietly. "I will be here when you return." The two men disappeared into the corridor, leaving Bryony alone with her fear and her racing thoughts. She moved to the window, staring out at the darkening moors, straining to hear anything from the study 2 rooms away. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. The silence stretched unbearably. Then she heard it. A crash. A shout. The unmistakable sound of violence. Bryony did not think. She ran. The study door was locked. She pounded on it with both fists, screaming Theron's name, hearing the sounds of struggle within. Glass breaking, furniture overturning, a grunt of pain that could have been either man. She looked around wildly for something, anything. Her eyes landed on a decorative sword mounted on the wall nearby, ceremonial, but heavy. She wrenched it free and drove the pommel into the door lock with all her strength. Once. Twice. On the 3rd strike, the lock gave way. She burst through to find chaos. The study was in ruins, papers scattered everywhere, a chair overturned. Theron was on the ground, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. Erasmus stood over him, a knife gleaming in his hand, his pleasant mask finally discarded to reveal the monster beneath. "So this is how it ends," Erasmus was saying, his voice no longer warm. "I should have made sure of you 6 years ago, but that fool I hired said you were dead, burned beyond recognition. Imagine my surprise when you crawled back to claim what should have been mine." "You killed them." Theron's voice was raw with fury. "Your own brother. Your own nephew. For a title. For an empire." Erasmus raised the knife. "One I have managed quite profitably these past years. Did you really think I would let you and your little bride destroy everything I have built?" "Stop." Both men turned. Bryony stood in the doorway, the ceremonial sword clutched in her trembling hands. Erasmus laughed. What do you intend to do with that girl? Cut me down? You can barely lift it. I don't need to cut you down. Bryony's voice was steadier than she felt. I only need to stall you long enough for the magistrate's men to arrive. Wariness flickered in Erasmus's eyes. What? Did you think Theron would confront you without preparation? The letter that exposed you also triggered a warrant for your arrest. Armed men are on their way from the village as we speak. They should arrive within minutes. It was a bluff. Bryony had no idea when or if help was coming, but she saw the calculation in Erasmus's face, the sudden uncertainty. It was enough. Theron lunged from the ground, tackling his uncle around the knees. The knife went flying. The two men grappled, rolling across the debris-strewn floor. Erasmus was older, but fueled by desperation. Theron was wounded, but fueled by 6 years of grief and rage. Bryony did not wait to see who would win. She scrambled for the knife, kicking it far out of reach, then grabbed a heavy paperweight from the overturned desk. When Erasmus briefly gained the upper hand, pinning Theron beneath him with hands wrapped around his throat, Bryony did not hesitate. The paperweight connected with the back of Erasmus's skull with a sound she would never forget. He crumpled. The silence that followed was deafening. Theron lay on the floor, gasping for breath, his uncle's unconscious form slumped beside him. Bryony dropped to her knees, her hands finding his face, his shoulders, his chest, checking frantically for injuries. Are you hurt? Theron, answer me. Are you? I am alive. He caught her hands in his, stilling their frantic movement. Thanks to you. Again. She laughed, a sound that was half sob. I seem to make a habit of saving you. I seem to make a habit of needing saving. He pulled her down to him, wrapping his arms around her with desperate strength. My brave, foolish, wonderful wife. They held each other on the floor of the ruined study, surrounded by destruction and unconscious treachery, and Bryony realized that she had never felt more certain of anything in her life. This man was hers. This life was hers. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The aftermath unfolded with surprising swiftness. Lord Erasmus Blackmere was taken into custody, his crimes exposed to all of London society. The men he had hired to murder his brother and nephews testified against him in exchange for leniency. The trial was sensational, covered breathlessly by every newspaper in England. Through it all, Theron and Bryony stood united. He testified before Parliament, describing the attack that had killed his family and nearly claimed his own life. For the first time in 6 years, he appeared in public without shame, his scars visible for all to see. When reporters asked how he had survived, he spoke simply. A stranger showed me kindness when I had no reason to expect it. That kindness gave me the will to live. And that same person. He turned to look at Bryony, who sat in the gallery watching him with tears in her eyes. That same person is now my wife, my partner, my reason for choosing to live fully rather than merely endure. The scandal surrounding their marriage dissolved overnight. No one whispered about the Duke buying his bride anymore. They whispered instead about the extraordinary love story that had begun in a forest 6 years ago and survived deception, isolation, and attempted murder. Erasmus was found guilty and sentenced to hang. Theron did not attend the execution. There was no satisfaction in watching his uncle die, only the hollow echo of what could never be undone. But there was peace. Finally, after 6 years, there was peace. And from that peace, something new began to grow. In the weeks that followed the trial, Bryony noticed a change in Theron that went beyond the resolution of his family's tragedy. He smiled more readily now, laughed more freely. He began accepting invitations to social events, appearing at dinners and balls with Bryony on his arm, no longer flinching when people stared at his scars. You are different, she told him one evening as they prepared for a ball at Lady Whitmore's estate. lighter, somehow. Theron adjusted his cravat in the mirror, a task he had avoided for years, because it required looking at his own reflection. I spent 6 years carrying a burden I did not fully understand. Guilt for surviving when my father and brother did not. Suspicion that I could not articulate. Fear that I was somehow responsible for not dying with them. He met her eyes in the mirror. Discovering the truth was devastating, but it also freed me. I know now that their deaths were not my fault. I know who to blame, and I know. His voice softened. I know that surviving was not a betrayal of their memory. It was a gift, one I intend to honor by actually living. Bryony crossed to him, sliding her arms around his waist from behind. They would be proud of you, your father and Cedric. They would be proud of the man you have become. I hope so. He turned in her arms, pulling her close. I know they would have loved you. Cedric, especially, would have been insufferably smug about finding me a wife with the courage to brain an attacker with a paperweight. She laughed. I will take that as a compliment. It is the highest compliment I can offer. 3 years later, the gardens of Ravenswick Hall had been transformed. Where once there had been overgrown hedges and neglected flower beds, now roses bloomed in profusion, their scent carrying on the summer breeze. The old maze had been restored, its paths once again hosting the laughter of children and the footsteps of guests, who came now in great numbers to visit the Duke and Duchess of Ravenswick. Bryony stood on the terrace, watching her husband chase their 2-year-old daughter across the lawn. Little Margot had inherited her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes, along with a stubborn streak that could only have come from both of them. She is going to exhaust him, observed a voice at Bryony's elbow. She turned to find Mrs. Drayton, the stern housekeeper, who had become something like family over the years. She exhausts everyone. That is her particular gift. Much like her mother, I recall. Bryony laughed. I was never so energetic. You convinced a duke to emerge from 6 years of isolation, exposed a murderer, and transformed this house from a mausoleum into a home. I would call that energetic. On the lawn, Theron had finally caught Margot, swinging her up onto his shoulders, while she shrieked with delight. The scars on his face crinkled when he smiled, no longer a mark of tragedy, but simply part of the man she loved. He caught Bryony's eye across the distance and grinned, a far cry from the cold, guarded stranger she had married 3 years ago. Fatherhood had softened him in ways she had not expected. So had love. "Mama!" Margot called out, waving frantically. "Come play!" "Go, Mrs." Drayton said with a rare smile. "The household will survive without you for an hour." Bryony descended the terrace steps, crossing the lawn to where her family waited. Theron shifted Margot to one arm and caught Bryony around the waist with the other, pulling her close. "Our daughter believes I am not chasing her fast enough," he informed her solemnly. "I suspect our daughter is correct. You are getting old, Your Grace. Elderly, decrepit, practically ancient." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "And yet somehow still faster than you." "That sounds like a challenge." "That sounds like a fact." Margot, tired of being ignored, grabbed fistfuls of both their hair and yanked. They yelped in unison, then dissolved into laughter. Later, after Margot had been fed and bathed and coaxed into sleep by her exhausted nursemaid, Theron and Bryony retired to the library. Their library now, filled with books they had collected together, annotated together, debated together. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm shadows across the familiar room. Outside, the moors stretched endless and wild beneath a canopy of stars, no longer threatening, but simply home. "Do you ever think about it?" Bryony asked, curled against his side on the settee where they had spent so many evenings. "The forest? What might have happened if I had not found you? I would have died." His arm tightened around her. "But I did not. because a stubborn 12-year-old girl refused to walk away from a wounded stranger. I could not explain it then, the feeling that I had to help, that leaving you was simply not an option. And now? Can you explain it now? Bryony considered the question, considered all the ways their lives had intertwined, the debt and the duty, and the desperate searching that had brought them together. But also the quiet mornings, and the fierce arguments, and the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. I think, she said slowly, that some connections defy explanation. We can call it fate, or chance, or providence. But whatever brought us together, whatever made me stop in that forest, and you search for me for 6 years, it was stronger than circumstance. That is unusually philosophical. I learned from you. She tilted her head up to look at him. You taught me that surviving is not the same as living. That endurance can become a prison if we let it. That the bravest thing we can do is reach for connection even when we are afraid. I taught you that. You lived it. Every day since I arrived, you have been choosing to live rather than merely exist. Do you know how extraordinary that is? How rare? Theron was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I spent 6 years believing that the girl in the forest had given me a gift I could never repay. But I was wrong. He turned her face toward his. The gift was not that you saved my life. The gift was that you showed me my life was worth saving. And then, when I found you again, you showed me it was worth living. Bryony felt tears prick her eyes. Theron, I love you. He said it simply, the way he said it every day. But somehow, it never lost its power. I loved the memory of you for 6 years. But the reality of you, the woman you became, that is something more than love. That is my whole heart, Bryony. Every broken piece of it, healed and whole because of you. She kissed him then, soft and deep and full of everything she could not put into words. Outside, the wind whispered across the moors, carrying with it the scent of heather and the promise of rain. Inside, the fire crackled, and the books waited, and their daughter slept peacefully down the hall. Bryony thought about the terrified 18-year-old who had climbed into a black carriage on her wedding day, expecting to meet a monster. She had found instead a wounded man who needed her as desperately as she had needed to be needed. Their story had begun with a debt whispered in a forest. It had become a truth spoken in daylight, witnessed by the world, and it would continue, she knew, for all the years they had left together. Some things were worth waiting for. Some people were worth saving. And some love stories, the ones that truly mattered, were worth every moment of the journey it took to find them. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. If this tale made your heart race, brought tears to your eyes, or reminded you that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, please show your support by liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing it with fellow lovers of romantic stories. Your support means the world to us and keeps our storytelling corner alive and thriving. Stay tuned. Another emotional journey awaits you. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for being here.